Welcome to the on-demand version of Sprout Labs, How to Design 70-20-10 Learning Ecosystems. I'm Robin Pettit, the founder and director of Sprout Labs. What we do with these particular webinars is we do an on-demand version, which is really just the bits of me talking and sometimes talking about some of the interactions that happen during the session. We don't actually record the live sessions because if we record the live sessions, what we find is people's interactions become a whole lot less, and because they're more subconscious that they're recording. So in this particular recording, what I'm going to be doing is a quick discussion of looking at the link between learning ecosystems and capability development, looking at what we see at Sprout Labs as being the key elements of a learning ecosystem, at the same time talking a bit about how digital learning can be used to really accelerate 70-20-10 learning. And then, last but not least, talking about design thinking and how design thinking can be used and applied to designing learning ecosystems. Now, our workplaces are being disrupted. They're in a spot where these three things, what I call the 3 C's, is really driving disruption. These disruptions are change, complexity, and collaboration. With change, either organisations are in the spot where they are being disrupted by smaller, newer players sometimes, they're using new digital ways of working, or they're in the spot where they are actually creating change and they're being the disruptors. It's a given. Change is a given in our modern workforces. Along with that, the work we're doing is becoming more complex every day. Our people need to be more experts in what they do. White-collar work, knowledge-based work is now also being automated. We've seen huge amounts of automation in manufacturing, and we're now starting to see things with machine intelligence and artificial intelligence and big data starting to help people make decisions in a different way, which then means that people actually are in a spot where the nature of work changes and the work is less about actually being inside of a process, and sometimes it's more about figuring out what the process needs to be. At the same time, the other driving force is collaboration. To do work quite often involves a collaboration between multiple different types of experts, and really a different way of working sometimes between organisations and sometimes between bits of organisations. The 70-20-10 model is a really perfect fit for this particular set of the 3 C's. If you haven't heard of it, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about what the 70-20-10 model is, it's just this idea that 70% of what we learn is through doing and experiential learning. 20% is through learning from others, quite often our direct managers, and then 10% is from actual formal learning. Now, when you sort of first think about this, you sort of look at it and go, actually, so does that mean we're wasting our time with formal learning? And that's not the case. In actual fact, some things are actually in a spot where formal learning is really, really important. And the notion of 70-20-10 is not a formula. It's more like a sort of vague recipe to sit there and do a whole. Actually, good learning involves quite often a bit of formal learning, some social aspects, and then some doing and experiential aspects. In our Learning by Working framework, we've actually got 3 design patterns which sort of show that different ways of and different learning problems you need to approach in different spots. The 70-20-10 model really means 3 major changes for the 3 major stakeholders in learning. Managers need to be transformed into learning leaders. Employees need to become self-directed learners. And L&D managers and people working in L&D need to become ecosystem designers. So I suppose in some ways, this webinar is really drilling into this last one around ecosystem designers, at the same time sort of thinking through it and touching on the other two as well. This move to thinking about the 70-20-10 as a dominant learning mode has been also coupled by the move to using and the shift in our language around learning to capability development. And even as I'm saying this, I'm not quite sure that I'm actually communicating this shift in the right way. And this is all a little bit of thinking in process. So capability development is a growing field. Sometimes it's people who've been working in L&D and moving into capability development, but it's also growing as its own independent field as well. My working definition of capability is it involves people, the classic bits we're used to of skills, knowledge, and mindset or attitude, depending on how you look at it. And more importantly, it also involves processes and making sure the processes are in place and having the right sort of infrastructure and resources. The other important bit about capability development is it's future focused. In some ways, learning and development has been very needs focused and focusing on process like needs development. Capability is about getting organisations and people ready for the future, looking towards the future and having the skills that might be needed for the future as well. In many ways, ecosystems are a really powerful way of building the capacity of an organisation and building the capacity of the people, processes and infrastructure, because it's actually about moving beyond just working with that skills, knowledge and mindset situation. My definition at the moment of an ecosystem is it's an interactive system of components that work together. They quite often work together to build more than the components are together. So it's a holistic way of thinking that the parts add up to being more than what the single component is. I've put together this bit of a framework of these 5 things, which we sort of see as being what a learning ecosystem needs. At the centre needs to be the learner. These learners need to be guided in pathways. They need places to practice new skills. At the same time, they need to make sure that the knowledge that supports are in place and available for them to do that as well. And then last but not least, there also needs to be spots for people to learn from each other. Now, I'm going to actually spend some time looking at each one of these aspects in more detail. So, quite often in organisations, we think about what the organisation needs from a learning experience. We sort of sometimes forget it's actually the learners that are doing that, and in actual fact, we need to focus on what the learners need to do differently. And that then, by focusing on what the learners need to do differently, what the behavioural change needs to be, then gets the business outcome. A really good example of this is compliance training, which is very much driven by organisations managing risks and then forgetting what the learners' actual motivations and buy-in and what their value proposition might be, and also forgetting what the mindset that might need to shift. So essentially, what we're trying to do with learning ecosystems is develop people into being self-directed learners, putting them at the centre of it, thinking through what their needs are, how they need to be supported, and how they need to be guided. A little bit of what I'm going to integrate into this recording as well is some principles from the Learning Way Working framework as well. So these are the things that are down the bottom here of that everyone should be always seen to be learning. Probably one of the most powerful things you can do to help people become self-directed learners is help them set goals, and help them set goals about getting better, not just about doing. And there's some really powerful digital learning tools and digital tools for doing this, like online performance management systems, feedback systems, and one really nice tool that I like and talk quite often about is the 70-20 tool. She's recently done a podcast of from Kath Granger about the 70-20 tool as well. So essentially, one of the keys to really helping people become self-directed learners is giving them solid goals and also giving them really good tools about self-assessment, so how they can self-assess and measure how they're going towards those goals as well. Part of that notion of self-assessment is about giving pathways. So you can't just sort of put people into a self-directed learning situation and say your goal is such and such. You need to actually give them guides to get there, especially managers. The role of being a middle manager in an modern organisation is not easy, and quite often you can support people by giving them sort of guides to programs and guides to having conversations with their teams and structures. These are the sort of things I'm talking about, sort of like prompts in workflows, and the sort of thing about the self-assessment. Online competency management systems can be really powerful as well. The with the workflows, that sometimes the same prompts that are used in learning management systems to actually remind people to do their compliance training, or that their team hasn't done their compliance training, can also be used to prompt learning transfer and give people ideas about the conversations they need to do and activities they need to help with as well. Now, the managers is a key enabler to learners. There's been so much research work around this, and it's a real shift for many managers, especially in strongly technical organisations, to move to a spot where their role is really around giving feedback, coaching and mentoring, and sometimes not being the actual expert as well. And that important part of that is actually giving feedback, and there's some really nice tools to be able to do some of these sorts of things. Really good online performance management systems can help to enable this sort of coaching process. But one particular tool I really like is the Coach Me one. So you essentially set goals and targets for check-ins, and it reminds you every day you need to do those. And then the Better Work system is a nice system for working with what's called OKRs. So I'm going in a little bit of a different order than what I did when I gave the overview of this, because in some ways we've gone from this notion of self-directed learner to managers as supporting learning to the next layer of sort of social learning, which is learning from each other, which we always quite often think and equate with communities of practice. I'm going to drill a little bit into what I mean by group learning in a moment, and also learning logs. I've just recently done a blog post on. Essentially, if learning can be made social and work can be made social, and knowledge can automatically start to be shared at the same time. I sort of think about this notion of learning from each other as being able, or sort of not so much being able to, but learning from each other is really about increasing reflection and articulation of learning. One of those great tools for doing that is learning logs, where people essentially just check in every once in a while about what they've learned, what they would do differently, and what they need to do next. And just be a simple sort of couple of hundred words every few days to sort of keep them focused on their sort of learning as a process. It's developed a whole series of digital learning tools and around social learning. Things like Tatara Social, Slack, things like Podio are actually designed as project management, but because of the social nature of them, they really readily lead themselves to enabling social learning. In terms of designing for some of these sort of moments from learning from each other, a lot of the time it's about looking for when there's natural spots where people might be able to come together and reflect and articulate their learning, which is possibly what I really mean by this notion of group learning. And these are things like lessons learned sessions, retrospectives, continuous improvement, and also issue management systems if they're done in a way that's not always negative. Just another really nice learning from each other is workshops that are run by peers. That in the past we've done quite a lot of work with GP training and some research work and evaluation work. And one of those projects was looking at what were the factors around which doctors got through exams faster. And one of the things we found was that the practices that had what we call group learning situations where the doctors were more likely to get through their exams faster. And so in these spots, it was possibly worked in a way where the practice was closed down, say once a fortnight or once a month, and everyone would come together for an hour or so for a learning session that was quite often presented by a peer. So in many ways, these are very much like the idea of lunch and learns as well. Now, underneath a learning ecosystem needs to be the right knowledge supports. I think one of our great confusions in learning and development is that learning is about content. Learning is really about a process. It's about building and changing behavior. It's not about delivering information. It's really sad that in some ways, sometimes the only way to access an organisation's knowledge and practice and way of doing things is actually through training, because it's not actually put into supports. Best practice examples aren't collected, knowledge bases aren't built, and a culture of building performance supports is not built. So it's sort of a waste to see that training and learning is sometimes used as information and awareness rather than actually using it for changing behavior. So one of the important things around building learning ecosystems from a capability to point of view is that sort of process and that infrastructure thing I was talking about before, is making sure that in actual fact the right sort of information supports are in place before you start thinking about a training spot. Another sort of thing around having the knowledge supports in spots, I also think one of the foundations of a learning ecosystem is just having an availability of content and resources. Things like buying in and having a content database of something like Lynda just gives that culture and ability to be able to access lots of reference material very easily and be able to access that at any time, anywhere, quite often. So another couple of sort of digital tools that can be used for this sort of knowledge support is wikis, because they're collaborative, and SharePoint. Another one is Degreed, which is another one of these sort of things that are a little bit like, actually not like LinkedIn, because it actually brings together lots of different learning from different spots. So it's not actually a learning resource database like LinkedIn. It's more an actual sort of bringing together of things. But it is quite a powerful one. And simple flipbook RSS readers to be able to be in a spot where people are being sort of encouraged to go out, look at information and knowledge, and be able to sort of collect that and communicate that as well. So, I mean, part of what I hope my message here is that the active part of learning in an ecosystem is really around what I'm about to talk about in a moment, is practice. But you still need to make sure you have the knowledge supports in place, but we shouldn't be using learning programs to make sure those are there. So places to practice. So in a learning ecosystem, you still need spots where people can fail, try things out. This is what really great digital learning looks like. Really great digital learning is simulating the sorts of decisions, places, the people that people are actually acting with. It's giving them a chance to practice and fail in a safer environment. Less so about technologies with this one. It's more about particular design approaches, and design approaches that include things like branching scenarios, what we call worked examples, which is sort of case study style things that are interactive, and then also really low-tech and high-tech simulations. Using paper-based approaches to simulations, where you might sort of have a series of scenarios on cards where you work with a facilitator and you actually bring out a scenario and you ask the group, well, what would you do in this case? These are your three options. And then going back onto another one. So just to give spots for people to be able to fail and learn. So your learning becomes, and your formal parts of your 10 in your model become a lot more interactive. The other way I sometimes think about this is that the 10, the formal learning, can actually learn from the 70 by actually becoming more interactive and more experiential. Learning systems are different, of course. They need different types of processes to think about the sort of bringing together of the whole. The classic instructional design approach of ADDIE sort of has this notion, by even having the notion of implement and evaluate afterwards, that it's event-based. In some ways, a learning ecosystem doesn't have to be event-based. It can actually just be a mixture of a pathway, a learning support, and a support from others to learn from each other. It doesn't actually have to involve a program as such. So what's really needed, I think, to really make learning ecosystems happen is a really different way of going about how we design learning. And for me, it's around using the processes of design thinking. Design thinking is about applying the principles that graphic designers, product designers, architects use in their practice to business processes. So it's not just about sort of visual, it's not just design, it's not about being at a spot where it's about brainstorming, but it's a really deep rethinking around process. Many instructional designers do use very similar things to design thinking, but sometimes don't use the chance of the ideation and the exploration phase to really open up to new possibilities and new ideas that are more like the ecosystems ideas I've just been talking about. Now, design thinking is both a process, and as we're working more with it and we're talking more to people about it and upskilling more organisations in design thinking, we're finding it's also really a mindset as well. Because I think in some ways the process of design thinking is quite familiar to many people. It's really about these sorts of steps. We use slightly different terminology to other people. It's about understanding and then diving into exploring. Some people call this the ideation phase. Then prototyping. Quite often this sort of stage of exploring and prototyping sort of merge together in this really nice way. Then at the same time, prototyping and testing sort of come together as one. Then it's also this notion of being constantly testing and constantly improving and constantly evolving also sort of works together, where you never see something as being solid. You're always measuring it to always look at where you can change it. The mindset of digital and design thinking is quite different to our traditional learning and development design approaches. I actually am going to talk through this fairly dense slide a little bit. Learners are really put at the center with design thinking. That learner in the middle of the ecosystem. Quite often ADDIE processes are premised on designing a course or other interventions. Design thinking is about opening up possibilities, being creative. It's really good for working with quite often ill-defined problems, because during that sort of exploring and understanding phase, you're really starting to really define what the problem is. One thing I constantly see is L&D people looking for processes that have worked elsewhere and trying to import them into their organisation without sort of looking at where there might be the possibilities in their systems and their organisations to be able to make really great learning happen. So this might be an example is from a recent podcast with Melanie Hawkins from Becker. They realised because they have their own project management system that's developed by them, they could actually build performance support and learning into the actual interface of their project management system. The process of quite often developing a traditional course is terminology like beta and pilot and implementation. Design thinking is iterative. It's about trying to build a prototype as quick as possible. It's about being action-focused rather than developing big, large blueprints. It's about trying to actually build things quickly. And it's really about collaborating and making sure the collaboration process is strong to make sure the end outcome's right, rather than being about approving and reviewing. Actually, the other thing is there's also just a whole lot of different testing and experimentation. quite often people think about design thinking and has this association with creativity and coming up with new ideas. It's also driven quite often by really strong measurables to make sure that those ideas are actually going to work in practice, which is that important part of that prototyping, taking it back out to people and making sure it's actually workable. Now, during the actual webinar, I weaved in a bit of a case study, which we did a little bit of interactive work around at this stage as well, because this next stage is really looking into the process and each one of those steps. This sort of first stage of understanding is really about developing a deep picture of who the learners are, what the business problem is, and also what the context is, making sure that the possible solution that's going to be designed is the right fit for the context, has the right level of, say, maturity around using digital technologies for the organisation. Now, it's important at this stage to actually develop this at a sort of emotive and empathy level rather than an intellectual level as well, because then as you build that sort of empathy, you actually step and start to what's quite often called walk in the shoes of. Some of the tools that are used to help build this type of empathy are things like being on the fly on a wall, where you actually sort of watch a process, watch something happen without being part of it. You just sit back, watch it, observe, and not question it. Then doing things like interviews with multiple types of stakeholders. And one of the favorite tools, I think, and one of the classic tools to use in interviews is asking why 5 times. It's a technique from lean thinking and lean manufacturing, and it's about drilling down to the real core reason why something's happening. And it's a really nice way of revealing the onion skins around something. Now, sometimes you don't actually even have to ask why 5 times. And really, it's just about someone says, this is the way it is, and you say, so why is it that way? And then they say da-da-da, and then why is it that way? And you keep on sort of drilling through, and you get to the real sort of root of the reason for things might be going wrong, or what the real reason for the learning situation is, or what the real motivations of the learners might actually be. And at that stage, you can start to build a very different type of learning solution. The end result from this particular stage of doing understanding and exploring is you end up with personas. And personas are sort of stories about people. They're normally given names and quite often developed as actual pictures. In projects, we've seen and worked with a spot where we put the personas up on the wall to be reminded that these are the people we're addressing. The other side of it is a certain type of person needs to be able to do a type of task. And those tasks then become the things that are really important around things. So you might end up in a spot where, just a fairly bland example is a line manager needs ready access to the performance supports. And then going, actually, okay, so putting that person through a 3-hour course is not going to work, because they really what's come out from it is they need to be able to get the information just at hand. The next stage is about exploring, and sometimes it's called ideation. Mixture of sort of things, but it's sort of about quite often co-creating a solution with a group of stakeholders. They might be learners, they might be people who are the content experts, but building it together with people. And doing it in a way where it's built as a group, and sometimes small groups, but also what's been progressively discovered in some ways, one of the most valuable ways of coming up with new ideas is for people to actually individually go away and explore things as well. That sometimes results in less groupthink. Now, another really important part of these particular processes is making them visual, and making them sort of visual and physical. I'm about to show a sort of tool that we use for both documenting learning programs and also using them in workshops as well. So essentially what we do is put these maps out at Officeworks, at big A0 black and white prints, and then use sticky notes during a workshop to be able to explore different types of learning strategies and how they fit together. they means that people can very quickly start to actually work with them. And sometimes some people even have sort of selections of strategies to go with these things as well. Now, the thing about this particular one that I've been really struggling with is it's linear. It actually has a beginning and end by having a left to right. So it sort of really then is great quite often when you're starting with something in the 10. Less so when you're trying to build something that's more an ecosystem based. So actually during the webinar, I tried a new format, which was actually more around that ecosystem knowledge, ecosystem components I just talked about, where you sort of put the sticky notes on each section. Haven't actually tried this with a client yet. It's still to be seen to see whether or not it worked, but it did actually work quite well during the webinar. So I will keep on exploring this as a possible format. Then during that exploring stage, quite often a few ideas emerge that look like they could be viable. These then become prototyped, and there's a few different ways that learning experiences can be prototyped. And the thing that everyone comes to mind when they think about prototyping is they think about user interfaces. The nature of a 70-20-10 ecosystem is it's quite often not actually easy to summarize in an interface. That's the nature of it. It's actually more moving parts. So what you sort of start to have is a mixture of things. User stories and learner stories that give a sense of how it's going to work. Walkthroughs, role plays, this is how it's going to work. In some ways, sometimes those learning diagrams I just talked about, I think I talked about the fact we actually use them for documenting. They can also start to act a little bit like a prototype so people can see how they can work through. So another part of this is when you actually do start to do what we normally think about as the implementation stage, you might just chunk that down into smaller spots. So it's more contained, more iterative, and you can build it up over time and get more experience as you start to work with it with learners and managers and with the organization. Now, just to quickly, I'm not going to read this out. This is a good example of one of these learner stories around how a program might actually work for a particular learner and what it means for them. Then we move sort of into this testing phase, this notion of actually taking the prototype, taking the small chunk out to a group of people, running it, piloting it, and seeing how it goes, and getting some feedback on that as soon as possible. And that might be as really low fidelity things of doing the story, or it might actually, after you've resolved that yes, or we might test, say, 3 stories, and then you might sit there and go, well, we're going to actually develop a chunk and a small chunk of one as a prototype. The interesting thing is some of the best tools for testing learning solutions are the same tools that are used for developing an understanding, interviewing people, observing. So some of the things you might be doing in this sort of testing phase is looking at what the business impact is, collecting stories of learners of how it's impacted, and also collecting data and thinking through what the effect of the actual program has been on outcomes. Now, quite often people at this particular moment go, there's no implementation phase. That's because in actual fact, with design thinking, it's fluid. It's a fluid model. It's an agile model where you are working in an iterative way, where you don't sit there and do a whole spot that's actually built in a solid way. You actually have a desire to constantly keep on improving it. I've seen repeatedly L&D people who are in that spot where they're constantly improving their programs get really fantastic results. Sometimes the constant improvements are not huge changes to the programs as they run and they work through the pilots. They're just slight differences, but they're putting it always in a frame of we can do this better, we can learn from this, we can improve this. So that was my really crash course in design thinking, just really an introduction to that, as well as the learning ecosystems. I think they're 2 ideas that are really matched and really work well together. Now, just like in the webinar and probably in the email message that you get when you get this, each week I spend a few hours focused talking to people that have been to our webinars. If you're interested in having a chat, just reply to one of the email messages you get from me, and reach out and we can organise a time. Thank you for listening to this and watching this, and I hope you found it valuable.